And basically, we're talking here in this chapter about the Judeo-Christian tradition. And that basically what we say about the Judeo-Christian tradition is that it is anchored or rooted or founded or based on the Jesus event, what we call the Jesus event. So that is really the focal point of the Judeo-Christian tradition. The Jesus event, a thing that happened 2,000 years ago, and how it has been interpreted through these years and through these centuries. So we started talking about the message of Jesus as well as his actions or activities. And very briefly, we just went through his life in the death and resurrection. We did not discuss much on the death and resurrection because that is going to be taken up a bit more in detailed in your course on Christology. So, but basically we are saying that if we go back to the Jesus event, we can pinpoint to on the reign of God as the central message of Jesus in all his actions, all his activities, whether it was healing, whether it was kind of other miracles that he performed, as well as his preaching and his fellowship meals, the whole attitude towards other people sort of embodied in a way the message, the core message that he was preaching, that is the kingdom of God or the reign of God in us. And it was his life as well as his death and resurrection that gave proof and witness to the message, the enduring message of the kingdom of God or the reign of God. In a way, from all his preaching and from all his attitude towards other people, we come to understand what it means to do theology according to him, his way of doing theology. And I think at the last session, we talk about the way of Jesus' way of doing theology, basically as talking about experiences of people, grounded, in other words, in the experience, the ordinary experience of people. But also, ultimately, it is framed within the message, the main message of his preaching, which was the reign of God. And around that theme, around that message would revolve all other things. But at the same time, he went on to prove in a practical way what are the implications of this faith in the kingdom of God or the reign of God. What are those things that we need to do in order to, in a way, validate the message? How do we put it into action? How do we put it into concrete pastoral action? How do we apply all of these things, these values, this vision that Jesus had preached about in our lives? So in other words, it is not something that is just purely an academic or intellectual kind of a way of doing theology. It is a very practical kind of theology rooted in the experience of people themselves. So this is what we have taken up so far. Now, as I have emphasized, but maybe not sufficiently enough in the previous classes, the fact that the Jesus event is central to the Judeo-Christian tradition. But equally important are the experiences of the disciples after the death of Jesus. So you can see, for example, on the screen, three columns of pictures. In the first column, on the one on the left, would be more on the Jesus event, what happened, his healing miracles, his preaching. Of course, at the very center is the death of Jesus as the crux, in a way, of his preaching. On the right-hand side would be the experience of the disciples. Above, you have Pentecost, and of course, the preaching of the disciples in many different places. Now, this would constitute what we would call the Jesus event and the first interpretation that was given to it by the community of disciples. So we can say this is a very, very important period in the history of the Judeo-Christian tradition, because this is a decisive point that, first of all, reveals to us what Jesus was all about, and then how that revelation was interpreted by those who have been able to experience Jesus in their own lifetime. So this is, in a way, quite different from our own experience, even if we can claim that we say we also have a Christian experience. We also have an experience of the life of Jesus and the message of Jesus. But in a way, we can say we are not privileged enough to be able to say that our experience was something that grew from our own immediate contact, physical contact, perhaps, historical contact with Jesus himself. And so, because this is so, it is important for us to bear in mind that when we speak about the scriptures, or what we call the Bible itself, especially the New Testament, we're here talking about something that is so unique, because it talks about the Jesus event as well as the interpretation of the disciples about this Jesus event. And that has always been the foundation of our faith. We always go back to the event of Jesus, but at the same time, we also go back to the interpretation that the early Christians, the disciples of Jesus, had about that particular experience. So, that in a way, we can say that the Jesus event continues in the experience of the disciples after the death of Jesus. You will soon find out, and you will find out a little bit more in detail when you go into Christology, that the what we find in the Bible are primarily accounts or narratives about how the disciples looked at the Jesus event, their experience with Jesus. And this is, in general, what we would term as New Testament Christologies or New Testament theologies, but more strictly speaking, New Testament Christologies, but because it is talking about their experience with Jesus himself. And this is what we find in the synoptics, especially in John, as well as in the letters of Paul himself. So this would form a kind of one big important tradition. The first 100 years of Christianity was a very decisive uh, moment in the development of Christianity as an institutional religion. So that we need to be very clear about what can we expect from, let's say, the Jesus event, and what we can expect from the Gospels, from the narratives that were the interpretations by the disciples. So, for example, from the Biblical Commission, the Pontifical Biblical Commission, they have issued an instruction on the historical truth of the Gospels. In other words, the question was, what part or what element or what data do we find in the New Testament can we truly say historically happened? What are the data that we can say are historical facts or historical data supported by, let's say, witnesses other than what we find in the Bible? So the Biblical Commission basically says that to judge properly concerning the reliability of what is transmitted in the Gospels, in other words, all the stories about Scripture, the miracles, the healing, the fellowship meals, the death and the resurrection of Jesus, the interpreter should pay diligent attention to three stages of tradition by which the doctrine and the life of Jesus have come down to us. In other words, we have received this tradition, and part of the tradition has been written down, what we would call the Gospels and the letters of Paul. These are all part of the written tradition. But we can rightly ask, what are those things that we can consider words themselves of Christ himself? Or what are those teachings and values that we can truly trace all the way back to the time of Jesus? Yes. Now, there are three stages of tradition according to the Pontifical Biblical Commission. And this is good for us to bear in mind. The first stage is the public ministry of Jesus himself. This is what I would call the Jesus event. In other words, it is the event when Jesus was here on the ground, on earth. But the second stage is what the apostles talked about or taught their disciples and their followers about this Jesus. So we can see already that what the disciples themselves have to be, in a way, you have to view them from another lens because it is now a second lens, a second stage or a second lens, because it is not the actual event of Jesus himself, but now the events of Jesus himself, the Jesus event, filtered through the perspective of the apostles. Now, that was what they were preaching about when they went to the different communities all throughout the Middle East, all the way to Rome. And this is what they were giving witness to, not only with their preaching, but also with their own lives. But there was a third stage, and the third stage was the writing down of the Gospels, or the what we call the evangelists' written Gospels, and now they were committed into writing by the what we would call the sacred authors. But again, we can understand that this is another lens, which was also a filter, not only of what happened during the time of Jesus, but also what the apostles were talking about. And this is going to be clear to us that in the time, let's say, if we look at the first 100 years of Christianity, the first 30 years was the what we would call the Jesus event. First 30 years. And of course, as we say, the Jesus Christ was crucified on the 30th, on the third on 30 CE. That is now the calculation, of course, the more updated calculation. But from 30 CE to about 45, that was the time of the apostles preaching. And among those people to whom the apostles were able to preach was Paul himself. It was during this time that Paul initially wrote what we would call two letters to to the Thessalonians. To the Thessalonians are among the earliest to be written, the earliest book to be written in the New Testament, probably about 45 CE. Then after that, we talk about the other letters of Paul. And then a little bit a little bit later, even further later, would be on around 60 or 70, you're talking about the Gospel of Mark. And then the Luke and Matthew would be shortly after the Gospel of Mark. And then the Gospel of John, being the last Gospel to be written, would be about 90, 80, the end of the 80s or the 90s, up to 100. So you can already see that in the first 100 years of Christianity, you have different layers already of traditions or interpretations. So that what we have actually in the New Testament is now what were written down by the evangelists themselves. So that would be stage 3. Some of the materials in stage 2, the apostolic preaching about Jesus, was probably recorded in the letters of Paul as well as in the Gospels, because in a way, especially the Acts of the Apostles, in a way, that was the people who were recording this were probably companions of the disciples who were also listening intently to what the apostles themselves were talking about. So, uh, so we have become so used to the presentation that we find in the New Testament that we go through, first of all, the Gospels, and then we talk about the Acts of the Apostles, and then the letters or the letters of Paul and the letters of the other disciples, Peter and John and James. Now, that is the way it was arranged. But in fact, when we look at the writing of these Gospels, that is not the way it really came about. Okay. Uh, I made mention here about Paul's own Christology, because actually Paul's Christology is much earlier than the Christology of the Synoptics or the Gospel of John. So when Paul speaks about Christ, he speaks about something that is so very crucial for him, for his own experience, which is not quite as crucial as for the other evangelists, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John himself. We will see this a little bit later on when we go into the other, the layers of New Testament Christologies. Here, and this is what we're talking about. For example, actually the New Testament developed according to different, the Christology of the New Testament developed according to different layers. In the first, let's say, up to 45 CE, the people, the early Christian communities were experiencing still what we would call the aftermath of the death of Jesus, the preaching of the disciples, and among them, of the disciples now, was Paul. But even Paul was talking about the second coming of Christ himself. So that would be what we would call the parousia Christology. So that was the first most important Christology at the very beginning of the apostolic preaching. Shortly thereafter, they developed a kind of what we call resurrection Christology, which was a way of explaining the new life that they had experienced, the new life of these early Christian communities. They have experienced something so different from their previous lives that they were willing to say that this is on account of the presence of the risen Lord in their midst, that Jesus is there among them. This is the way they explained what was going on in their own Christian community. And later on, some of the gospel writers, particularly Luke, or Mark, Luke, and Matthew, would be talking about the ministry, what Jesus did, what happened during the, let's say, the last 3 years of the life of Jesus. What happened to him? What did he do? So there are now stories about what really happened. So you can imagine the apostles recalling for their other disciples about the events of Jesus. What happened during the baking of the bread, what happened during the multiplication of loaves and fishes, the healing of the blind, etc., etc. All of these things were probably our stories being told by the disciples. And shortly thereafter, of course, people will be asking, who is this after all? Who is this person who is doing all these miraculous things or these great, wonderful things that were happening to them? And so they were trying to ask the question, what was his family background? What is his boyhood? But that would be about the year 60 to 70 CE already. And then further back, Luke, for example, as well as Matthew, will be talking about conception. What happened before he was born into this world? So that's why we would find in Luke and in Matthew stories about the Annunciation, as well as the stories about the Nativity, about the birth of Jesus himself, which is not what you would find in the Gospel of John or nor the Gospel of Mark. Mark starts his Gospel with the baptism. And after talking about the conception Christology, John and maybe his disciple will be asking, what is there before the birth of Jesus himself, before the human existence of Jesus of Nazareth? What was there before? And so this is what is called pre-existence Christology. The Christology that would go all the way back, not only to the time of the birth of Jesus, but all the way back to the beginning of creation. And of course, even before that, because if Christ is divine, if Christ is God, then he has to be before the creation. So this is how the Christology in the New Testament developed through different layers. So in fact, if we talk about the Gospels, for example, of Matthew and Luke, you find that the first materials that they talk about, conception, the birth of Jesus himself. Now, these are stories that probably were the last ones to be retrieved, from the preaching of the disciples. And they were trying to understand how this would fit into the whole picture of the Jesus who was a wonder worker, was a great preacher, and of course, one who died himself. So you will see more of this. But what I'm trying to say here is that the first 100 years of Christianity is so decisive because this is a very important uh, understanding of what really took place, how they interpreted the Jesus event, and how we are supposed also to interpret them. What is the message that's being conveyed to us by all of these things? And they have written them down in the Gospels and in the other books of the New Testament in order for us, in order to help us in our own faith. So the interpretation of the Jesus event by the apostles and the evangelists is crucially important for the rest of Christian theology. It is what is contained in the New Testament. And without the New Testament, we cannot even talk about the Jesus event. But again, for us to bear in mind that we cannot interpret the New Testament in a literal way, in a historically literal way, because all of that has already been filtered through different lenses of interpretation, from the apostles to the disciples of the apostles, and then, of course, to the later groups who wrote down these stories about Jesus. So, and that is why we call the scriptures as the norma normans non normata, is the absolute norm in a way. It is a norm that norms us, that provides us with a basic understanding, but it is not something that is influenced by us. It is something that is there as a kind of a given. That's why it's called non-normata. We will explain this a little bit more in the next chapter, chapter 7, when we talk about how we are to interpret or how to appropriate this message into our own times. Basically, we're saying that the scriptures is the guiding rule on the basis of which all other succeeding interpretations are accepted or rejected as faithful interpretation of the Jesus event. You will find that from here on, from 100 CE now up to our own time, our reference point is always the New Testament. Always we go back to the New Testament. We can reinterpret the New Testament there, given our own research. We can reinterpret it, but there is something there in the New Testament that basically contains the essentials of our faith, the essential Judeo-Christian tradition. But that Judeo-Christian tradition is continually being reinterpreted, first by the apostles, and then by the disciples of the apostles, and then by what we would call the fathers of the church, the doctors of the church, the theologians later on who would come, Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages, and later on in the 1500s, the Council of Trent, in up to our own time, including our own present-day theologians. But again, always referring back to what happened in the time of Jesus, because that will be the lens from which we will be able to look at everything else, whether it's our interpretation of the biblical text or whether it's our appropriation of the biblical text in our own context. Okay, so fundamental theology is basically a theology that talks about revelation and faith. But revelation, properly understood, is much more complex than simply a matter of saying, God has spoken, therefore what I relate to you as the speech of God or the message of God is true. It's much more than that. Okay, so for a long time, we have made a distinction between tradition and scriptures. And we owe this distinction practically from the Council of Trent. Because during the Council of Trent, the church had formulated a kind of an understanding of the relationship between tradition and faith that can sometimes be misinterpreted. But the context of it, the historical context of this debate, was the Reformation. The Reformation basically who criticized the practices of the Roman Catholic Church because they claimed they were not found in the Bible. So the reformers basically said there's only one absolute authority as far as our faith is concerned, and that is the Bible, what the Bible says. Okay. What we have to interpret at that time, what the Bible says is interpreted as what you would find there in the Bible. So you would find many Protestant groups who would go back to the Bible and quote a particular passage and interpret it in their own way and say, this is really what is found in the Bible, therefore we have to stick to this. Now, the reformers were faced with many practices in the Roman Catholic Church that could not be found in the Bible. Even the way we celebrated the Eucharist is something that was not found in the Bible. There is something there about the Last Supper, for example, but it's a very basic kind, which at that time in the 1500s were no longer that simple. It was a very complicated kind of a ritual. Aside from that, there were different practices, for example, the indulgences and many other devotions that have become part of the traditions in the church that have become part of the many practices in the church that have been imposed on the people in some instances, but also that have been considered or put before the people as truly matters of faith. So the reformers were trying to say that I beg to differ. Only the matters that we find in the Bible are the matters for faith. Anything else are what we would call traditions that have been made by us, human beings. Therefore, they are only human traditions. They are not part of what we would call the biblical revelation. So this is what they were trying to argue against. And part of the practices, of course, at that time have to do with the practice of the indulgences. And the indulgences became like a money-making scheme of the Roman Catholic Church in order to build the Basilica of St. Peter. And the reformers were very much against it because not only they were not against the building of the St. Peter's Basilica itself, but they know that the people who were running the papacy were far from virtuous. They were scandalous themselves, and perhaps they were misusing all kinds of maybe the money of the church for other things. So they were just trying to get as much money as they could from other people and then misuse them. That is not something that new. It's also something that even until now happens in our own experience. Okay, so this is the context of the reformers. Now, in answer to this, the Council of Trent said or made a distinction between the scriptures and traditions. According to the council, traditions are practices that flow from the teachings of the Bible. In other words, what we have in the Bible are teachings, but flowing from those teachings, interpreting those teachings in our own time, in our own context, in our own cultural context, would be this, what we call different traditions. And so their legitimacy, the legitimacy of the traditions is based now on the fact that they flow from the Bible. They are what we would call interpretations of what is the biblical text. To a certain extent, that some of the practices were like that. For example, the way we celebrate the Eucharist is something that is based in the Last Supper, the experience of the Last Supper. But more than that, it's based on the experience of the fellowship meals that Jesus himself had performed or had experienced. But what has happened, of course, is that as this particular practice of the Eucharistic meal grew in terms of its celebration, in terms of its ritual, grew through the centuries, then therefore a lot of things were added to it. to make it more meaningful to a particular time and to a particular group of people. That is how it happened. So this is what the Council of Trent were saying. Now, this particular distinction enabled, in a way, the popular tradition or idea of revelation being having two sources. And those two sources are, first, the Bible as the written source, and the traditions as the oral source. So we're talking about revelation that has two sources: the Bible as the written part, and the the rituals, the practices that we have, like alms giving, for example. These are all practices, and even the way we would do confessions, because they're developed now several ways of doing confession from the time of the fathers of the church. These are all what we would call oral traditions. They were handed down to us from oral tradition. So oral practices. They are not written in the Bible, but they are based basically on the Bible. So, so they speak of the two source theory. Revelation having two sources. Revelation being sourced from the scriptures, tradition, and the traditions. Scriptures being the written part and the traditions being the oral part, just for us to bear in mind. Now, since the Second Vatican Council, the two-source theory has been supplanted by a fuller and richer understanding of tradition as the entire process. So, for example, the Constitution on the Revelation, on divine revelation, Dei Verbum, would speak about tradition as the entire process. I will give you a quote a little bit later on. So, there is one tradition that encompasses both scriptures and the local cultural traditions, oral traditions that may have existed for many, many centuries. So, if we just try to think about tradition, tradition is the whole process itself. But within that whole process, there is what we would call the scriptures, which is the norma normans non normata, which is the basic text and the basic experience that we always refer back to. But then there are also other things that grew from the scriptures. They are now what we would call culturally determined or cultural expressions of what we believe in. So the way we celebrate the sacrament, for example, is a whole new tradition. We don't see all the sacrament being traced all the way back to the time of Jesus himself, except in a very, very general way. Baptism, of course, is something that can be traced all the way back to the time of Jesus, and the same thing with the Eucharist. But the other sacraments, they are they need to be understood in the wider context of the scriptures, in the wider context of the experience of Jesus himself. Okay, so Dei Verbum, for example, Constitution, Divine Revelation, Article 8 says, now what was handed on by the apostles includes everything which contributes to the holiness of life and the increase in faith of the people of God. So that is the purpose of handing down, in order to contribute to the holiness of life and the increase of faith of the people of God. So that would be everything. And that includes, of course, the scriptures as well as the interpretation of the scriptures. And so the church, in her teaching, notice teaching, life, and worship, perpetuates and hands on to all generations all that she herself is, all that she believes. So this is what is called tradition with the bigger capital T, with the capital T, tradition. This is the process of handing on what we believe, what we have taught, how we have worshiped. This is the whole process of handing on to the next generation. So we are still part of this tradition. And in our own way, when we try to appropriate the tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, according to our own cultural context, then we are adding to that tradition. We are adding to that. And this is what we will be handing on to the next generation after us. So here, the concept of tradition is much wider, much broader than simply all those uh, oral traditions, as we spoke of them in the Council of Trent. So tradition is much bigger. Tradition includes the written part as well as the oral part. Now, the oral and written distinction, of course, is not going to be much use nowadays because there are even some traditions that we have that are not part of the Bible that have been written down. Well, for example, all the sacramentaries that we have, all the lectionaries that we have, the liturgy that we have, or all the celebrations of the sacraments, they're all written down, of course, but they are part of what we would call the traditional beliefs and practices of the Christian community. So, tradition is the ongoing process of new faith interpretation in a new lifestyle. So, generations of Filipino Christians or Asian Christians will be looking to what we have done at this time. Maybe 20 years later, or 30 years later, or maybe 100 years later, they would be asking, how did the Asian Christians during this time, 2020, celebrate the Eucharist? How did they do it? How did they do? So that we could learn also how we can interpret it in our own times. So we are part of this tradition. So tradition is the handing on of the church's own identity from one generation to the next. Now, the traditions with the capital small letter T and with S, the traditions, those are the acts, the beliefs, the values, the rituals, the practices that are being handed on. Everything that we have, even the way we do theology, is part of this tradition, and we handed them on. In much the same way that the theology of the fathers of the church in the first 500 years of Christianity, we are also learning from how they were doing theology, because that is all part of the big tradition. Okay, so I have tried to picture for you what happened actually. So the whole tradition is the process of handing down. So what we would call in the patristic age, we would have what we would call the Judeo-Christian tradition and its interpretation. Among those people, of course, who interpreted the Judeo-Christian tradition are fathers of the church like Ignatius of Antioch, or Augustine, or Tertullian, or Origen, or Cyril of Alexandria, Athanasius, and all the fathers of the church. They were interpreting what was there in the experience of the apostles, the first 100 years. They were trying to interpret what it meant for them, for their own time. And so we can understand that their interpretation, because of the context, which was basically philosophical, but basically Greek and Roman philosophy. That was their background, that is their framework. So they would come up with the teaching that would be interpretations, but the structure and the language of it will be according to the language of Greek and Roman philosophies at that time. And that is why we speak of transubstantiation. We speak about two natures in Jesus, or the hypostatic union in Jesus, because those are part of the language that they use in interpreting the Judeo Christian tradition they have inherited. During the time of the Middle Ages, for example, Thomas Aquinas and St. Anselm and Albert the Great, they did not use, well, they were influenced initially by the philosophy of Plato or Neoplatonic philosophy, but later on, they much rather use the Aristotelian philosophy. So, in a way, we can say the tradition had been reinterpreted by Thomas Aquinas and his companions, but from the framework now of the Aristotelian philosophy. So that's why we can say that the Aristotelian explanation or interpretation of the Judeo-Christian tradition is a bit different from what we would find in the patristic period, because the predominant philosophy during the patristic age was basically Neoplatonism or Platonism. And even Augustine himself was very much influenced by Neoplatonism. But in the Middle Ages, we have changed a little bit from the Neoplatonism of the fathers of the church. They moved into the Aristotelian philosophy. So now, from that time on up to our own time in 2020, we have now the Judeo-Christian tradition that we are speaking of now would be consisting of all of the traditions that we have inherited from the time of Jesus, the time of the apostles, the time of the evangelists, the time of the fathers, the time of the medieval scholastic philosophers and theologians, and even the Council of Trent up to our own time. This is all now part of the tradition that we have inherited from the past. But our duty, our responsibility is to reinterpret it for our own times so that it makes sense to us in our own lives. It makes sense to us so that it becomes something meaningful for us in the present moment. That is the task that is before us. So in 2020, we have inherited that Judeo-Christian tradition, and that is our reference point once again. But we are also given the freedom to reinterpret what we see. And then our, again, measuring stick, the basis or the criteria of whether our interpretation is correct or wrong would be the Judeo-Christian tradition. We go back again to the Bible. We go back again to the time of the apostles, the time of the fathers of the church, to the theologians of the Middle Ages, and see the consistency of our own arguments or our own interpretation according to what they have laid out before us. So this is the whole process of handing on our tradition. And this is important to bear in mind when we talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition, because this is not something that is static, that has already been closed. It's like inheriting a treasure, and that treasure is already in a treasure box, and you cannot change it. No, it is a living tradition. It's a tradition that calls for reinterpretation, because unless it is reinterpreted, then it doesn't make sense many times in our own in a given age or a given period. So that's why we can speak about different theological traditions. As I mentioned to you, theological traditions are multiple in the church itself. Even in the time of the fathers of the church, the time of the patristic age, where we can even talk about two different schools on Christology. There is what we would call the Alexandrian Christology and the Antiochian Christology. And they emphasize a different aspect of the faith. For example, when we talk about the Alexandrian Christology, the Alexandrian Christology gives emphasis on the word becoming flesh. So that would be the expression that is most associated with Alexandrian Christology, the word made flesh. Verbum caro factum est. The word became flesh. Whereas in the Antiochian Christology, the emphasis is on man. And he became man. Homo factus est. That is the Antiochian school of Christology. They're talking not about they're talking about the word, of course. We're talking about the same person. But their emphasis would be on him becoming one like us. Okay, so their emphasis would be on the human, because at a certain point during the patristic period, the idea of the human Jesus, the human nature in Jesus, was downplayed. And then, of course, the fathers of the church emphasized that if we are going to downplay the human part of Jesus, then there is something that is a very serious implication in our own faith, which has to do with salvation. If it is not truly human, if it is only half human, if it's only pretending to be human, then he could not stand for us, human beings. He could not be our representative because he is not fully human. On the other hand, if he is only half God, if he's only like he's really a human being with some divine qualities, but he's not really God, then he cannot save us because if he is not God, then a half God is not able to save us. Only God can save us. So these are very important traditions, and even at the time of the fathers of the church, they are all always debating about this. But the church had maintained both of them as important as you would find in the Nicene Creed. You would find them both: the Word made flesh, and He became man. Both of them are contained in the creed. There are also other traditions that we would call traditions in terms of practices, like Augustinian traditions, Benedictine tradition, Thomistic traditions. And now, of course, later on, we would have the Jesuit tradition, we have the Vincentian tradition, we have the Redemptorist tradition, we have all kinds of other traditions that have become part of who we are as a church. Okay, these are all different traditions. These are different ways of interpreting the mission of Jesus. We are basically talking about the same mission, the mission of Jesus, but they are interpreted in a particular way. So, for example, the Augustinian tradition is very, very big on the idea of the God saving us, pure and simple. And this is from this Augustinian tradition that Luther would branch away from. But he would be still uh, influenced greatly by the Augustinian tradition, because in Luther we find a great sense of being sinful, but that is part of the Augustinian tradition. Luther, of course, goes other ways and moves on towards other things. But when you talk about the Benedictine tradition, we're now talking about the monastic tradition. So when people talk about these groups, for example, the Karyana that you have there in Pampanga, in Mangalang, they are thinking like they're like Benedictine communities. These are all monastic communities. They are trying to live their Christian life according to the tradition of the monks, the Benedictine monks. Now that's one way of living the faith. There's another way of living that we have, like in dioceses or in religious communities, or even in what we would call secular institutes. These are all different communities. The Claretians would have their own traditions. They live it according to the Anthony Maria Claret. So, the Vincentians according to Vincent de Paul, etc., etc. These are all different traditions. And what happens, of course, in the church is that the more traditions there are, the more variety there are, the richer our own faith becomes, because we look at it from different perspectives. Not only that, of course, when we start talking about church practice or tradition, especially our liturgy, we can speak about the Byzantine tradition, the Roman tradition, the Latin tradition, the Ambrosian tradition, the Orthodox liturgies. Those are very different. And they cannot just be ignored because they go all the way back, as old as the Roman tradition, as old as the Latin tradition. So you cannot just ignore the Byzantine tradition and the Orthodox traditions. They are very, very rich. And also Catholic social teaching. You will find later on in your moral theology courses about Catholic social teaching. But the way we behave towards others, especially towards the poor, is already something that we find in the way Augustine himself would speak about the poor, or even the Benedictines, or even the monks, and even Francis of Assisi. All of these things are part of what we will call the traditions in the church in regard to the poor people, in our mission towards the poor. And this is already part of the wealth in the richness that the church has, precisely because of these many multiple and different traditions. Okay, let me end here and let me give you time to ask some questions. The matter on the Judeo-Christian tradition, I will go through it very briefly. I will try to summarize. But the last point that I need to emphasize here in this chapter is the idea of doing good theology. What are the characteristics that we would expect for a good theology? And I think I made mention, I think, about this already in our last class. But in any case, you referred to SEDMAC, thesis number 17, where he gives us characteristics of good theology, something that is real. There are facts that we need to face, that they are faithful to Jesus Christ event. It is also praxis oriented. In other words, it's something that has to be brought into reality, meaning it's sustainable, appropriate, empowering, and challenging. So, not just intellectual pursuit, but of course, almost always faith seeking not only understanding, but also action. So, I have made I have asked you to read the two readings on the examples of a revelation faith experience as it has been what we would call updated or brought to the present. And they are the articles of Chauvet on sacrifice and Father Danny Pelarius and his companions on rituals of passion, violence, and compassion. Those are already available in the readings since several weeks ago. Okay, now just to go back to recall again, to recap the dimensions of Judeo-Christian tradition. As we said already, Judeo-Christian tradition is a kind of human experience with what we would call with a twist. The Judeo-Christian tradition is a human experience with a twist, but they have practically the same dimensions. So the process that we are talking about when we speak about revelation faith is the same process as what we would speak about when we speak of experience and interpretation. So revelation and faith are correlatives. They go hand in hand. When we speak about what we call the immediate interpretation, that goes hand in hand with our experience, because we experience but at the same time interpret at the same time. When we do the second level of interpretation, then it's something that is already a bit of a second step already. But Judeo-Christian tradition also would speak about some cultural beliefs, like about God, salvation, about the afterlife, values, cultural values, what is good, what is true, what is beautiful, and ritual customs such as cultural customs such as rituals, sacraments, and pastoral. If you go back to the history of Judeo-Christian tradition, you will find, of course, you go all the way back to the time of the Israelites and even go further back into the experience of Moses and the people of Israel in Egypt, all the way up to our own times, going through what is this, the Jesus event being the what we would call the horizon of our interpretation, because it is against this horizon, against the Jesus Christ event, that we interpret or evaluate what our present day practice, Christian practice, are all about. Practices are all about. If we look at the social dimension of the Judeo-Christian tradition, we know that Judeo-Christian tradition speaks about a relationship not only with God, but also with our own fellow human beings. So a relationship with one another, as well as with God, and as well also a relationship with nature and with those of other faiths. Like any human experience, Judeo-Christian tradition will also have a politico-economic dimension. We have seen this already in the history of the people of Israel, as well as during the time itself of Jesus himself. The Roman Empire, the judges, and the kings, those are very real people. But they are part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. How did the Christian community respond to the challenges that was brought before them in this political economic organization? Institutional, in terms of church structures, communitarian, hierarchical, worldwide, local, parish, or small Christian communities. These are all different levels of institution in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And we can see that the church has continued to change or to to have its organizations and its institutions evolve or develop in time, because it is responding to the current situation. But in terms of way of thinking, philosophical, it has a very Judeo-Christian tradition, of course. That's why we speak about theology, or we speak about a worldview. It has a worldview. We're talking about what is the perspective from which we take off, uh, especially when we're dealing with matters that are not only religious but also are very much social or belonging to the country or the nation. So, therefore, what is the difference between human experience and Judeo-Christian tradition? Judeo-Christian tradition is a human experience, but always in the context of religious belief. Okay, so these are different dimensions of the Judeo-Christian tradition. I'd like you to be aware of this. I call them dimensions. Can also call them elements. Now, we are going to watch a video, and the video is the interview of the